Fantastic. We are so delighted with the feedback that we've had so far, and we were very glad to see many of you at the reception that we had last night. We have, again, a great day ahead of us, and I want to just a couple of housekeeping issues. One is, again, the conference app. That conference app was designed to lower our environmental footprint, so you'll notice there's not a lot of things in your bag, but that material is on the app. So please take a look at it. You'll find a lot of very important resources and products, studies and reports that relate to our conference that are there. So please check it out and use it. And again, use your tweet. If you're a tweeter, use that often and well so we can share what we're doing at our conference around the world. And I think we were trending yesterday. So for those of you who are doing it, thank you very much for sending the messages of what we're doing around the world here. I have a distinct pleasure again today to introduce the chair of and the host of this conference, Dr. Jaime Sepulveda, who's done a phenomenal job with his team making this conference what it is today. So, Dr. Sepulveda, please.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Seems to me we had a great success with the reception last night. This room yesterday at this time was absolutely full, so I'm hoping people will recover from the reception soon and join us promptly. I came here to UCSF almost 5 years ago, and at the time the chancellor was Sue Desmond Hellman. The irony is she recruited me from the Gates Foundation to come here. Then when I was here, she went to the Gates Foundation. So the transition here at UCSF has been very, very successful. Chancellor Sam Howard has been in his position for almost 2 years now. He's a neonatologist by training. He was chair of the Department of Pediatrics and then dean of the School of Medicine, and now chancellor of UCSF. I feel very honored to be part of his executive cabinet. Sam has been an amazing supporter of global health, and I believe that part of his legacy will be what we do in global health at UCSF. Sam Howard.
Thank you, Jaime, and congratulations on, with your team putting this conference together. I'm told there are 1,800 people attending. We have 1,500 alumni in a hotel just up the street, so I think UCSF is doing its piece for the San Francisco economy this weekend. So it's my pleasure just to welcome you all here to our city and to the Bay Area. I noticed that the theme for this year's conference is planetary health, and it seems fitting that a conference on planetary health is being held here in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. We certainly like to think of ourselves as big thinkers here in San Francisco and at UCSF, and why not? 1949, the United Nations was started here in San Francisco. 3 decades later, the biotech industry got going in partnership from UCSF and Stanford, and 4 decades into that revolution, the pace of biomedical discovery is only accelerating. In fact, I've been in medicine now for 40 years, and I've never been more excited about where biomedical science is, where the future and potential for healthcare delivery and impacting people's lives are. But even as we celebrate that intense excitement, I think we all recognize that there is a deep chasm between the haves and the have-nots around the world. And each of our institutions that are represented in this room, I know, are doing their part for fighting that chasm and trying to reduce the inequities that exist around the globe. Here at UCSF, we have an intense focus on HIV/AIDS epidemic. Got started here in the early 80s, and since that time we have made it a major effort currently in East Africa. You're going to hear from Eric Gooseby in a little bit this morning when he hosts a panel in his role as the global ambassador for TB. We are also fighting TB, malaria, and many of the other issues that confront the globe, most recently Zika, with our scientists really trying to understand exactly the molecular penetration of Zika across the placenta and into the newborn brain. We take the definition of global here to mean that it starts immediately at our front door. And therefore, we cannot have an impact on global health unless we look at our own institutions and make sure each of our own institutions is, in fact, a shining beacon for social justice, equity, and inclusion. We must do that if we're going to have an impact globally, and I thank each one of you for making sure your institutions are doing exactly that. So I welcome you to San Francisco. I'm proud that UCSF is able to host this conference yet again. Jaime mentioned Haile Debas, one of my mentors and heroes. I think he conceived of this consortium just 10 years ago, so it's incredibly exciting to see from that germ of an idea that Haile had 10 years ago to this wonderful conference here today. So enjoy the conference and enjoy our city despite a little bit of spring rain. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm John Dirks, President and Scientific Director of the Gairdner Foundation, and I'm very grateful to Keith Martin and CUGH for having us here to present our 2016 Canada Gairdner Global Health Laureate and to have that person address the audience. In 2009, the Canada Gairdner Awards, which had for 50 years given the Gairdner International Awards for seminal discoveries in biology and medicine, decided it was important to look more widely into the global world and to establish a new award called the Canada Gairdner Global Health Award, which would be given for any one of 4 reasons: for major scientific advances in basic science, clinical science, population health, or environmental health, provided it had impact in the developing world. I'm very honored and humbled that as I approach my retirement, our board has named the award after me. I find it still difficult to deal with that. Now, the selection process is carried out by 14 very august global health experts and leaders that are cited on this slide. And you'll recognize many of the names. They come from 6 countries, including those from India, South Africa, and Japan. But also you'll recognize in the audience individuals such as Haile Debas, Roger Glass, Tachi Yamato, and maybe some others that are here. And they do a terrific job in looking at our nominations every year. They meet usually in cold January in Toronto. It really sharpens the mind. And then we announce the awards at the end of March, having contacted and spent time with the laureates. You can see that the cast of past laureates is pretty rich and has covered many of the key domains of infectious disease, in particular throughout the world, beginning in 2009 with Nubia Minoz in human papillomavirus, Nick White, who did the spade work for getting artemisinin ready for a malaria treatment, Bob Black, who you saw yesterday in terms of malnutrition and diarrheal disease, Brian Greenwood, who did so much for prevention of malaria through protective mechanisms, and our own lovable King Holmes, who did so much in STS and HIV, and then 2 years ago, Satoshi Omura, who found a microorganism in a Tokyo golf course that, and the only time that ever happened, that led to the development of ivermectin, which is rolling back for the first time in the history of mankind, river blindness. And last year, Peter Piot, for his great work in HIV and Ebola, and he made Peter, when he visited Canada, made a tremendous impression in the very places that he visited. So this has been a very successful enterprise for us. What we're calling for here at this meeting, too, is interest by this audience to nominate people. We get many nominations in communicable disease. Although nominations so far in non-communicable disease, chronic disease, is somewhat more sparse. And so we're looking to encourage that area. It's even more sparse in the environmental health area. It could be more brisk in the population health area. We've had excellent nominations. We're just making an extra push now to get a stronger yield so they can present to you in subsequent years outstanding people. Now this year we're going to honor one of the most remarkable people in world medicine, in Dr. Anthony or Tony Fauci, who has been the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at NIH for, I think it's 32 years, maybe it's a little longer already. And what the citation reads the following: for his many pioneering contributions to the understanding of HIV infections and the extraordinary leadership in bringing successful treatment to the developing world. Dr. Tony Fauci has done many things, and he has an incredible, prodigious curriculum vitae, which has really underlined many of the single points in the pathogenesis of HIV/AIDS. One could mention many, but one is to say the concept that even though the circulation may be cleared of the virus, it still lingers on, still mutates in lymphoid tissue, and set up the very principle that the treatment must be ongoing and permanent. And what a transformative aspect that has been as antiretrovirals were developed as targets, and has now totally changed the disease from a very acute, devastating disease as we saw in the 80s and 90s to the chronic disease it has largely become. Dr. Fauci's publication record is almost without parallel. Overall, in research as a whole, he's the 14th most cited researcher of all time, as they say in the West, dead or alive, in any field. What I always find very compelling when I flip on CNN, even up in far north Toronto, and there's a new disease such as Zika, Tony Fauci's there as an authority, as a powerful, knowledgeable figure, as a person who brings about calm, and a person who plans progress. So it's an astounding person that he is. And what could be more astounding than to have the political neutrality to deal with 6 presidents? If I missed any, Tony, correct me. Ronald Reagan, George Bush I, Bill Clinton, George Bush II, Obama, and whoever is yet to come. So that's been quite an achievement. But among those achievements was to marshal the compelling argument that why the United States should have a President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. And this has, for the last 13 years, provided the funds, especially in Southern Africa, to lower the incidence of HIV and to reduce the mortality. It's far from over, but it's changed dramatically. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tony Fauci to the stage. He's going to speak on ending the HIV/AIDS pandemic. We had followed the science. He's added an achievable goal. Let's congratulate him and hear him.
Thank you very much, John. I'm really quite honored and privileged to be up here speaking to you this morning in the context of the Canada Gairdner Global Health Award. I want to talk to you today about something that might seem somewhat bold and rash to talk about, the achievable goal of ending the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but I hope by the end of my discussion I will have convinced you that this is something that truly can be a reality, and why I feel that we can and should marshal all our resources towards that, because it in fact is achievable. So I want to share with you a story that I know many people in the audience have actually witnessed and partaken. And for me, it really all started 35 years ago, almost to the day, just a couple of months shy of 35 years when I was at the NIH, where I still am now, and the first of this pair of MMWRs landed on my desk in June of 1981, reporting 5 men, curiously all gay, with pneumocystis pneumonia from Los Angeles. And having been an infectious disease person for the previous few years, it became clear to me that if they were otherwise normal, why indeed would they get pneumocystis carinii pneumonia? I thought it was somewhat of an oddity. It bothered me a bit, but it did not really strike anything other than wondering where this would go. But a month later, in July of 1981, when the next 23 cases of what turned out to be HIV/AIDS, but then was just known as a strange malady, again among gay men, now not only in LA, but in San Francisco, in New York City. And I could say without hyperbole that from that day on, my entire career, and indeed my whole life, changed as it evolved over the next 35 years. And that's really what I want to talk to you about. I changed everything I was doing. I was talking to some of my colleagues last night at dinner, and I think for those who were not there at the time, the feeling of uncertainty was extraordinary. I decided I was going to stop everything I was doing and start admitting these young men, who at the time were all gay men, to our hospital outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. My mentors thought I was completely crazy and that I would be throwing away a very, very promising career by getting involved in studying these unusual groups of patients. So I felt I had to write an apologia pro vita sua, namely, why am I doing what I'm doing? Because all of my mentors thought I was a bit nuts to do it. So I wrote an article in the fall of 1981 and submitted it to the New England Journal of Medicine, who actually rejected it because they said it was too alarmist. And what I said if you could see the title of the paper, we didn't even call it AIDS then. It was the syndrome of Kaposi sarcoma and opportunistic infections. We were calling it GRID at the time. And I said, because we don't know the cause of this, any assumption that it's going to stay restricted to the population that we're just recognizing right now is truly an assumption without scientific basis. And then from then on, everything exploded. And right now, you fast forward 35 years, and this is the challenge we're facing. I want to get back to that first slide. I still believe I'm going to show you reasons why one could doubt whether this is an achievable goal, and I think I'm going to convince you why I believe it will be an achievable goal. About 37 million people are now living with HIV. A total of 70 million were infected. 1.2 million deaths, 2 million new infections. In the United States, we tend to be complacent because we have such a good healthcare system, relatively speaking, and we have the accessibility of drugs, but we cannot forget that there are 1.2 million people living with HIV, and importantly, and I'll get back to this in a moment, 13% of whom are still unaware of their infection. Over 670,000 people have died with AIDS, and the very embarrassing and disturbing statistic is that we have about 40 to 50,000 new infections each year, and that has stayed that way for about 10 to 15 years, and we can't seem to get below that. And if you look at the demography, it is particularly disparate with men who have sex with men, particularly African American, particularly young people, 22 to 25% between the ages of 13 and 24. This is a statistic that is truly troubling. We see it, it's numbing, we almost can't believe it. But if you look at the lifetime risk of HIV diagnosis among men who have sex with men, 1 in 2 African American men who have sex with men in the United States will wind up HIV infected. And that is something that is just so unacceptable, it's beyond description. Not even very good for Hispanic, 1 in 4, and if you look at white men who have sex with men, it's about 1 in 11. On World AIDS Day, just a few months ago, in December 1st, the New England Journal of Medicine asked me to write an article talking about the scientific pathway to get to where we are. And I entitled the article, it's shown on this slide, Ending the HIV/AIDS Pandemic, and as John said, that was the original title of the talk, Follow the Science. So what I want to do is connect the two themes of following the science and the feasibility of ending the HIV/AIDS pandemic as we know it. And when I say ending the epidemic, I'm not talking about the eradication of HIV. I'm talking about ending it as a pandemic that we know it, namely have a dramatic decrease in the inflection or deflection of the curve, which I think we can achieve. So let's take a look at what has happened over the last 35 years as we have followed the science. I could spend the entire day talking about each and every one of these areas of scientific advances because they are truly breathtaking in their scope and in their depth. But one stands out very strongly among all the others, and that is in the arena of the treatment of HIV-infected individuals. But treatment didn't just evolve in a vacuum. It evolved in the understanding of the virus itself. And a good example of that, if you look here, I show this picture almost all the time when I talk about the historical aspects. This is a picture of me in the ward that I still make rounds on every week at the NIH, and this is in the late fall, winter of 1981, 1982, with an individual who was admitted again with what we were calling GRID. And the reason I show it is that at that time, by the time they came into us, and I don't need to tell my colleagues here in San Francisco something that they know well because they lived through it, that when someone came into the hospital with advanced disease, the median survival was about anywhere from a year to a year and a half, sometimes even less early on. And the reason I show this is because I want to get back to what has happened in those extraordinary years as we plotted through trying to understand the virus. The first was understanding the replication cycle of the virus, which, as we all know, once we got that molecular virology down, what we then had were vulnerable targets for the development of targeted antiretroviral therapy, which actually, even though there was targeted antiretroviral therapy before HIV, targeted therapy really was born with what we did with HIV. And it's shown here on this slide that over a period of years, we now have more than 30 drugs, which when given in combination, now today, even with one pill containing 3 drugs, we have particularly and completely transformed the lives of HIV-infected individuals, such that in the same, and I tell our fellows about this every time we make rounds, in the same room where I was standing there looking at a patient that had an expectancy of 1 to 1.5 years, if they come in now and we put them on combined antiretroviral therapy, we can look at them in the eye and say that if you're in your 20s and you're young and you start your therapy, that you can predict that you'll live an additional 50 years. And that means that a person can have almost a normal lifespan. It isn't only restricted to the developed world because, as we know from PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and other organizations, we've now been able to get up to 16 million people on antiretroviral therapy, which when you extrapolate that to deaths averted, it's more than 8 million deaths have been averted since the year 2000. Now, there's also prevention. Obviously, it isn't all treatment, but back early on in 1981, 82, the only prevention that we had was behavioral modification, use of condoms, plus minus the exchange of needles and other works for injection drug users. But as I'm going to get to in a moment, all of a sudden the prevention modalities start to incorporate medically mediated prevention, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, having said all of that, the foundation for treatment and prevention, and why I believe that this is something, if implemented, could do what I'm telling you from the beginning, is turning around the trajectory of the pandemic, is HIV testing itself. Namely, you test an individual, and in the city of San Francisco, they do it better than anybody else, I believe, is test anyone and everyone. Now, if you test someone, there's only 1 or 2 outcomes. Either they're going to test positive or they're going to test negative. If they test positive, we have what we all know is called the care continuum, which, for those of you not familiar with that, is from the time a person gets infected to the time their viral load is below detectable level, which, 1, will save their own lives, and B, will prevent them from infecting others. There are certain landmarks on that continuum. Now, this is a slide showing what the percentage of people
in each stage of the continuum. Now, as I told you, 13% of people don't know they're infected, so 87% are diagnosed. The blue bar next to the red bar is people who are between 18 and 24, which means younger people do much worse than the cohort in general. And as you go down the continuum, it gets really rather depressing. 39% receive medical care, 36% prescribed AIDS, 30% are virally suppressed. Now, in different areas, like here in San Francisco, it's much better. At Hopkins, it's much better if you look at the clinic in Hopkins. But as a mean for the country, we are doing really very poorly. As I tell my colleagues when I talk in the United States, I ask them, can you give me some countries that do better than us? And the one I always bring up is Rwanda. Rwanda is doing much better than we are in the percent of people who are actually have suppressed viral load. So it really is an embarrassment for a developed nation to be doing this. And I'm bringing this up to you because if we want to have this as an achievable goal, we need to do much better than that. So again, getting back to, we have to have a target if we're going to accomplish the goal. So I ask the question, we all do, who is infecting whom? And if you know who is infecting whom, then maybe you can do something about it. So take a look at these statistics, which are really very, very, very depressing. The 13% who are not diagnosed, they're HIV infected, they account for 30% of the new infections. The issue of health care in this country is absolutely hits us like a Mack truck when you look at the second bar down. People who are diagnosed but not in care account for 81.3% of the new transmissions, which means if you just figure out who's infected and get them in care, you would automatically decrease by 92% the number of infections that we have. And there's that ceiling that we see of that 40 to 50,000, which we can't seem to get over. So getting back to follow the science, there's been a lot of concern and debate over the previous decade and a half about how aggressive we should really be in seeking out and treating people. So there were 3 major studies in which science proved all the naysayers wrong. The first one, and those of us who were taking care of patients know it, early on, should we try to keep people off therapy as long as we can? Is it better to be off therapy than on if you don't have to be on therapy? Because it looked like maybe therapy has toxic effects that you don't want in the long term. So we did the SMART study, which, as some of you may remember, that you treat somebody if their CD4 count drops, you don't treat them if it goes up. And as it turned out, it was without a doubt that episodic ART was inferior to continuous ART. Then came the transforming study, HPTN 052, which showed something that I think turned around the field of HIV, that if you treat people who are infected and you bring down their virus to below detectable level, you decrease by 96% the likelihood that they're going to infect somebody else. And then finally, the last study, a year and a half ago, which was the START study, is should we really treat everybody or should we wait until we get below a certain level? And that study, I think, was the showstopper because what it showed that at any CD4 count, if you treat someone right away as opposed to waiting until they get down to the guideline levels, you do much better if you treat someone right away, which comes to the conclusion that you have to make, that you must treat essentially everybody who's HIV infected with no excuse not to do that. And that gets into what I refer to and we'll get back to as the implementation gap, not only here in this country, but in certain areas of the world do much better than others. But there's also an issue of prevention for that, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So speaking of prevention, in a somewhat simplistic world, if someone tests negative, we used to say, wow, you tested negative, you escaped the bullet, thank you very much, have a nice day, and you're done. But that's no longer the case. And the case is that if you're in a risk category and you test negative, there's an analogous continuum of prevention that we must follow the same way that you follow an HIV-infected individual. Counseling and risk stratification, retention in services, adherence, and in fact, getting back to that circle that I showed you, of the combination of HIV prevention modalities, it's not one size fits all. One is not necessarily good for everyone, but a combination of them can absolutely turn things around. Now, one of the interesting things that's evolved over the last few years is the interdigitation of treatment with prevention. And there are 4 areas, and I don't have time to go over all of them. I'm only going to touch on a couple of them. One is the one that was extraordinary, was the prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Seminal studies years ago that if you treat the mother during pregnancy, now we know you just treat the mother anyway. You treat everyone who's infected, but back then you could prevent the transmission of mother to child. The other is post-exposure prophylaxis, and then the 2 that I'm going to just spend a moment on is the issue of treatment as prevention. When we did the 052 study, you know, there's always the question of the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. So efficacy means it works in a trial. Effectiveness means it works in the real world. So we knew that in the trial, if you treated people who were infected, you decreased their likelihood that they're going to transmit to a sexual partner. But what about in the real world? Every place that we have looked, if you look at an aggressive program of putting people on therapy, test and treat, the incidence in that particular region decreased. And I could give you 10 examples. I'll just give you a couple. In Baltimore, particularly at inner city areas where the Hopkins clinics are involved, if you look at the blue, those are the percentage of people who are now virally suppressed. And you look at the red, that's the incidence that are estimated in that community. If you go to Rwanda, it's the same thing. As you increase people's treatment in the blue, the incidence goes down in red. Now, the thing that I believe is as important as anything else is something that this city of San Francisco has been the major proponent of, and that is the issue of pre-exposure prophylaxis, which has an interesting history because, as you might expect rather simplistically, if you take a drug, it works. If you don't take a drug, it doesn't work. And there was a lot of concern about whether pre-exposure prophylaxis really was something that was going to have an impact on what we do, because the original studies, if you did all of the entry and intent to treat, was 47%. But when we went back and looked at people who actually took their pre-exposure prophylaxis, it was stunning how effective that was. And in fact, that's exactly what we see, and I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of that that have been recently published. A particular one was in Kaiser Permanente San Francisco Medical Center. They began pre-exposure prophylaxis, mostly in men who have sex with men, as opposed to not giving it to people with the same risk. And it turned out there were essentially no new infections in more than 2.5 years for the people who took the drug. Now, nothing is 100% effective, but this is about as close as you can get. Now, that's the good news. The sobering news is that when you do a study, 1 in 3 primary care doctors and nurses have not even heard of PrEP. So there's something really wrong with that if you look at the way we do medicine, how you have a highly effective prevention modality that 1/3 of the people who see these patients have never even heard of it. Again, if we are going to have this achievable goal, we really have to do much better than that. So that gets me to something that we did just a couple of months ago, is that I was trying to figure out a way how we could express this, and I was talking with some of my colleagues in the press, and I wrote an editorial or a commentary in the Washington Post, and I said it the way I think it really is, that there are no more excuses. We have the tools to end the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And the only way to do that is to close the implementation gap, which is rather severe, and I've pointed out several examples of that, at the same time as you follow the science to develop more scientific discoveries that you can ultimately implement. And in that regard, there are 2 challenges that remain in HIV discovery. I believe we could turn around the trajectory of the epidemic without either of these. But I think if we really want to put the nail in the coffin of this, we want to have at least one and probably both of these. So let's take a look at what people are referring to as a cure. a very, very difficult challenge that actually may not be achievable. That doesn't mean we are not going to try as best as we can to do it, but we've really got to be realistic. So let's take a look at how the field looks at HIV persistence. So I want to not use the word in the big category of cure, but look at HIV persistence. There's two ways that you address that. You either eradicate the reservoir, which by definition is a classical cure in the sense of how we in infectious diseases know of cure. We don't usually talk about a remission of an infectious disease, except with HIV. We generally, you give somebody penicillin, their pneumococcal pneumonia goes away, it's a cure. Now, with regard to a classic cure, there have been 4 ways that people are approaching that. And the science has really been extraordinarily interesting, and we hope that it will lead to the fruition of where we're going. The first is latency reversing agents, and in other words, disrupt the latent state and try and get those cells cleared. We've tried that. I've tried that in my own lab for years. It's a very difficult situation because just when you think you have the last cell out, it isn't out. The other is immunotoxic therapy directed at the reservoir. We know now with the Tim Brown Berlin patient cured by a stem cell transplantation with a delta 32 deletion where we have a cell type that cannot be infected, that is not particularly feasible to do on a long term, particularly with the fact that this is something that sometimes the treatment is worse than the cure. But gene therapy is really something interesting, namely being able to edit genes that are autologous cells and reinfuse them back. This has been led by Carl June and others at the University of Pennsylvania, but now that we have the possibility of CRISPR-Cas9 technology, we may be able to do a much, much better and precise job of that. So this is something that we just need to keep our eye on. The thing that seems to be more feasible, and when I say more feasible, I mean it's easier to do, is if you can get sustained virological remission at the same time as you withdraw antiretroviral therapy. So this is a scheme that we have been working on for some years and a number of labs have. The first thing to do is early treatment. Early treatment would mean you preserve a degree of immune response without destroying the complete immune system. And number 2, the size of the reservoir is much smaller when you start early. And I know that we did that in our lab, and a number of labs have done that for years. Then there are 3 possibilities. Either if you have withdrawal of ART, natural HIV-specific immunity would prevent rebound. No lab that I know of in the country or the world has seen that happen, because every time we stop therapy, there's always a rebound. The other is things that are going on right now, and I don't have time to go over the individual data, but there are a number of laboratories, ours included, who are using now passive transfer of monoclonal antibodies to individuals at the same time as you withdraw ART to see if that can suppress. And the third is therapeutic vaccination, which has now been rejuvenated as we get more and more candidates, with the ultimate goal of discontinuation and sustained control of HIV viremia. Whatever we do, we need to realize that if we are going to be talking about an HIV cure, it's got to be simple. Not that everybody has tertiary care. There are 37 million people living with HIV. They're not all going to get tertiary care in major medical centers. It needs to be safe and not worse than the current treatment, and it needs to be scalable. It would be interesting to have a boutique, an occasional case report of that, but that's not what we're talking about when we talk about the disease in general. So now let's talk about what I consider scientifically one of the most difficult challenges that we have ever faced, and that is in the development of an HIV vaccine. And that is very relevant to what I'm saying about the achievable goal of a durable suppression and turning around of the epidemic. Now, vaccines historically are really quite interesting. I break it down into 2 types of approach towards vaccine. In this case, an HIV vaccine. What's the empiric or inductive approach, or what I call the theoretical or deductive approach? Now, believe it or not, the empiric approach has been used in every successful vaccine that we've ever made. And the empiric approach means look at what natural infection does And natural infection usually winds up with an immune response that turns out to clear the microbe and leave you with long-lasting protection. So why don't we mimic natural infection by giving whatever it is, the virus, the bacteria, attenuated, killed, then you try to improve on that. The other is theoretical or deductive. Try to figure out what the best immune response is, and then design an immunogen to induce the correlate. Now, let me give you an example of the empirical or inductive approach. So at NIAID, because we're the Infectious Disease Institute, we've developed a lot of vaccines for a lot of diseases. You can almost predict that we will have and do have an Ebola vaccine. And the reason we do is because Ebola induces a response. It kills a lot of people, but if you keep them alive, the immune system kicks in, you clear the virus, and you do well. The same thing with Zika. We're working on a Zika vaccine right now. You never, ever say with confidence you're going to get it, but I'm pretty sure we're going to wind up with a Zika vaccine for the simple reason that people recover from Zika and clear the virus. The difficulty with HIV is that we don't have that. So even though we tried with the empiric response, we had results, particularly with the RV144 TIE trial, that was not ready for prime time. It was 31% efficacy in a trial. Now, that may be opening the door to where we want to go, because at least we know now, and we were humbled by this trial, because everyone was looking for cytotoxic CD8 cells and neutralizing antibodies. And when we came back and looked at immune correlates, we found out it was not neutralizing antibody and there was no CTLs. It was an IgG antibody against the V1, V2 region of the envelope, one that we weren't even looking at because it was a variable region. The non-neutralizing antibodies mediate ADCC, and there was an interesting paradox of IgA antibodies correlated with increased infection. So where are we going with this? We need to improve on it. So right now, ongoing and soon to be initiated, particularly in South Africa, are trials along the lines of the original RV144 trial in Thailand to look for increasing strength, breadth, and durability. And you do that with multiple boosts, modified vectors, and adjuvants. So that's something we need to keep our eye on. However, there is now going on in the field of HIV a most extraordinary effort and endeavor by some very, very good people looking at something that we've never really had to do with any other vaccine. And it's extraordinary, it's challenging, and there's no guarantee. So let me explain what that is. If you assume that broadly neutralizing antibody that is existing before a person gets exposed, namely vaccine-induced, that you would protect. Now, if you look at broadly neutralizing antibody, this gets back to the fact that HIV doesn't prove a concept. Because these antibodies are only detected in about 20% of infected individuals. Now, why is that? That's the only infection that I know of. When someone gets infected, 1/5 of the people develop neutralizing antibodies. That's the bad news. The worst news is that it usually takes them about 2 to 4 years to develop the neutralizing antibody. And by the time they do, the neutralizing antibody neutralizes everything else but their virus. Very difficult situation. The other thing is monoclonal antibodies from these demonstrate a high degree of somatic mutation, which means they need a lot of stimulus, which is not good for a vaccine. You could have a couple of boosts, but you don't want to be boosting somebody for 3 or 4 years. And then also they have unusual traits as autoreactivity. So what has the field been doing? If you look at the HIV envelope trimer, and you then take those monoclonal antibodies that we get from people who are infected, you clone their B cells, you get a monoclonal antibody, even though now, to remember, by the time these antibodies were developed, the person had advanced HIV. And with that, all those little squigglies are names of monoclonal antibodies. And there are now over 100 that have now been described. But the interesting thing that they do is that they bind to a certain part of the envelope trimer, which defines what we call neutralizing epitopes. So the critical issue and the major challenge in HIV vaccinology is how do you get those neutralizing epitopes to be in the form of an immunogen that induces broadly neutralizing antibody that the body doesn't particularly like to do with natural infection. That's a serious challenge. But I believe the field is up for the challenge because 3 critical factors now have evolved. They're shown on this slide. The first is the stability of the HIV envelope trimer. HIV is a very, very smart, metaphorically smart virus. And why is the stability of the trimer important? The HIV envelope is naturally unstable. So when the virus goes in, envelope changes conformation when it binds to CD4, and it exposes immunodominant parts of the envelope that induce an immune response, except the immunodominant parts don't give neutralizing activity. One of them is the V3. It flips out, you make an antibody against it, but it's not neutralizing. Stable trimeric envelopes preferentially bind neutralizing antibody. So you can make a reasonable assumption that stable trimeric envelope would serve as the preferred immunogen to induce broadly neutralizing antibodies. So what are people doing now? They're using cryo-EM, they're using structural biology, mutational changes in the envelope to have a stable envelope trimer. And these are just a couple of the very elegant papers from people throughout the country using extraordinary sophisticated techniques to create a stable envelope trimer. Now, once you have the stable envelope trimer, then you have another big challenge, and that is targeting the germline B cell. In other words, when you look at the epitope that you want to induce an antibody to, and you fish around the B cell repertoire, often you can't find a germline B cell that reacts with it. But now we're starting to see that, and by that we mean being able to pick out those B cells that actually do bind in their germline conformation and then allow them to mature with high affinity. Now, once you do that, and this is a recent study that came from Bill Schieff's lab in which they did just that. They targeted the germline. But then the question is, how do you sequentially engage the B cell lineage to make this neutralizing antibody? And as often happens in medicine and science, experiments in nature give us a clue. And this was a paper that was published by Bart Haynes a couple of years ago in which he had the opportunity to study someone immediately after they became infected. And he followed the virus and the antibody response as the virus infects the person. You make an antibody response, it selectively induces mutation in the virus, which then replicates, and you get a different antibody response, and you go down the pike. And what happened with the patient, as shown here, the virus kept on mutating, it kept on driving the immune response, and about 2.5 years later, the person finally had a really good broadly neutralizing antibody. But it was too late for the patient. So the question is, how do you do that with a vaccine? And one of the ways was described in a nice schematic diagram by Michelle Nutzenzweig is just that, namely to sequentially induce and coax along the B cell lineage over a reasonable period of time so that you can wind up with broadly neutralizing antibodies. In other words, let the sequential stimulation over a short period of time mimic what the virus does over 2 years. When I try to describe that metaphorically, I kind of think of the virus and the antibody going back and forth, almost like a complex kabuki dance between the virus and the antibody lineage. But that's exactly what's happening. Now, we can't forget the T-cell approach because I've been talking mostly about antibodies, and clearly T-cells are important, both because of the help they provide for B cells, their antiviral cytokines, but also with some studies that have come from Lewis Picker's lab that you can induce under certain circumstances CD8 positive T cells that can have a very important effect on clearing infected cells if in fact the vaccine lets some cells through. So when we talk about a vaccine, what are we talking about? We have a 31% effective vaccine. Are we going to get a measles-like vaccine for HIV? I really don't think so. I hate to be down on this, but I don't think we're going to get a 98% effective. So what is going to be the level of protection that we're going to need in combination with the comprehensive prevention modalities that I spoke of. And I can't even predict what that's going to be. It's going to be 55, 60%, or what have you. But I think that a vaccine that does contribute to the already existing prevention modalities that we'll have will allow us to get me back to the first slide to say that if we follow the science the way we have from the first recognition in 1981 until today, with countermeasures that we've developed and those that can be developed, but importantly, if we implement the scientific discoveries, which has really been, in my mind and the mind of so many others, the major gap. I refer to that as the implementation gap of scientific discoveries that we are already aware of, but that we're not implementing them, not here in this country, and very often not in other regions of the world. If we do those two things, I do believe we will have a durable end to the HIV/AIDS pandemic as we know it today. And again, just so that you don't overinterpret what I'm saying, I don't mean eradicating HIV from the world. That's not going to happen, and if it ever happens, it's going to take a long, long time. I'm talking about turning around the trajectory so that we can say right now we are heading towards the ending of the pandemic as we know it. I think it's possible, and in fact, I look forward, and I think it's going to be within the realm of many of us who are in this room, that someday I'm going to come to one of these meetings, get up here, and instead of talking about an achievable goal, I'm going to be talking about a goal that has been achieved, and that's going to be a very fine day. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've shown your appreciation so well for an outstanding speech, but outside an indefatigable pursuit of a very tough question, giving us a glimmer that maybe finally, after these years, the solutions could be around the corner. In October, Tony Fauci, along with our other 6 Gairdner winners, Frank Plummer, the Canadian winner, also relating to HIV, and our 5 CRISPR winners for adaptive immunity and gene editing will be in Canada promoting Canadian science to universities and high school students and being honored on October 29th with their award and prize. We're very privileged to have you, Tony, as one of our laureates this year. Thank you for being here, and hang around for the next session.
Thank you, Tony, for that magnificent speech. Now we will have a round table. My dear friend Eric Busby will be moderating. If the panelists would kindly come to the front. Tony, Peter, and is Diane Havler here? Oh, here she is.
I want to thank Dr. Fauci for a stimulating and outstanding march through what really is a breathtaking example of a bench-to-bed continuum of inquiry, discovery, having the issues that were brought up in discovery of a natural history, pathogenesis, pathophysiology, taking those relevant realities that they present to medical delivery systems, policy discussions occurring, program being informed and put to ground, in a way that continues to position itself in front of where that virus is moving through the population, and in the context of an individual, how that virus is moving through and attacking their own immune function. I think that bench-to-bed example really is uniquely reflected in the response to HIV in many ways more than any other disease process. We went from no understanding to responding because we had to without knowledge. But HIV is an example of the identification of the correct question, the question answered, and a relatively rapid translation of that fact, of that science, into the programs that have been able to impact the people who have been infected with this virus. I think that the people who are at the front here have played different but unique roles in arming that response to be continuously effective, have developed systems and in both surveillance and in political engagement that have completed those circles of science to policy to program, and I am honored to be part of this discussion group. I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to give a brief kind of overview of where we've been and where we're going. I'm going to let Dr. Fauci kind of end that discussion with just any extra statements he wants to make or amplify on from the other two. We'll start with Dr. Piatt, and then Dr. Havler will follow, and then we'll open up for a discussion. Peter.
Thank you, Eric. It's really great to be here, and congratulations, Tony. It's a wonderful talk, and you really set the tone of what is feasible. And I'm an optimist, and I think the AIDS movement has demonstrated over and over again that we can overcome the incredible obstacles that that are there and that are a reality before we get to the to realize the dream and the aspiration. We have to follow the same path of a combination of very rigorous scientific analysis, seeing what is possible, what works, and so on, and at the same time work with the communities affected, because otherwise there is no chance that we can have any impact. And the title was I think here on 1990. It's a slogan. It's part of the strategy how to get to ultimately through treatment have viral suppression, and in that sense reduce the reservoir of people who are driving the further spread of HIV. It's highly ambitious, but we already know that from a few places here in San Francisco, but also in Botswana, as was recently found, that this is possible. But let's now have a look at a number of the issues. So I think I may be here the one of bring the bad news, but I think, Tony, you already alluded to the formidable obstacles we're facing. And the first one is on viral suppression, because that is really fundamental in the strategy. As Tony showed, we still have a long way to go, including in high-income countries. In the United Kingdom, for example, we have still, despite the National Health Service, despite widespread testing, and despite actually quite good involvement of the community, continuing high rates of new infections in the gay community, despite viral suppression. Although I must say that initiation of therapy is later than we would like to see. And a lot of that has to do with an epidemic that we see, what we call chemsex, with very much driven by a compensation of increased unprotected sexual activity. And so if you multiply 99 times 90 times 90%, you end up with like 70% viral suppression. That means that the 30% under even that strategy that would still not be virally suppressed. And the key question is, who are these 30%? Are these 30% the ones who probably are just recently infected, in other words, are highly infectious, are in many countries those who are marginalized, if not illegal populations because of discriminatory laws, particularly around homosexuality and injecting drug use. And so the question is what to do about that. And that means that we have to really concentrate our efforts on those who are the most vulnerable, who are the most infectious, and that will require also working at the political level, because often that's where it happens. So that's the first obstacle we have to overcome, and I think that we should probably devote more attention to that, that's all, the 30% there. Second issue is the retention and care, and I assume that Eric, you will talk about that, but we have a real problem in some places. In some parts of the world or some cities, in some communities, it's fine, although let's not forget that in order to remain effective in terms of treatment as prevention, this will require continuing adherence to antiretroviral therapy for forever. And retention in care is not only a matter of people are forgetting or they don't want to take their drugs and so on, but we have a major issue of stockouts of antiretrovirals in many parts of the world. The Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa is actually a special program as a watchdog, and it's sobering. There are clinics where there are no antiretrovirals for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And that is a recipe for resistance development, for all kinds of problems. We have evidence enough that one needs to the treatment. So here it's a combination of devoting more attention to, again, the community health services and so on, but also finding better ways of better first-line treatment, long-acting injectable treatment could work and so on. So that's the second issue, the retention. And original innovation, I think, in delivery. We need probably to go beyond the delivery system in many countries that is based on the classic clinical model. Third issue is one that I don't hear too much about, and that is the fact that there is an increasing need to switch to second-line therapy. It's evidenced by the bills of, for antiretrovirals of many national AIDS programs. It's not well documented. Just as resistance is not well documented, there are alarming reports, but they're rarely, if ever, on representative samples. They're usually concentrating on people who are failing therapy for whatever reason, and so no surprise that there is increasing, resistance. How is that going to evolve over time? We all believe, I hope, in evolution. When you exercise, evolutionary pressure, something must happen. And again, here we need more research. We need more effective first-line therapy that can't fail, and also far wider spread viral load testing point of care. Fourth issue, and I only have 5, is that one of the issues that I'm most concerned about is the sustainability of antiretrovirals, of generic antiretrovirals. That supply is at risk. There are only 10 producers of generic antiretrovirals in the world, and 2 companies actually account for about 60% of all antiretrovirals, and in Africa that's even more. The needs in APIs are enormous. I looked it up, and it's like 12,000 metric tons by 2020. Many of the big pharmaceutical companies only use a few thousands of metric tons of APIs per year. The prices are rock bottom. and with very low margins, and the barriers to local production are enormous. So we must make sure that we're not waking up one day and then say there are not enough drugs. That I think could be a looming crisis. And then my final point is about funding. There's still a major shortfall, and the funding is flat. The needs are still going up, despite what some may say that it will go down soon. I don't think that's very realistic. Just in sub-Saharan Africa alone, there will be a need of $40 billion by 2030. Calls for shared responsibility are not always realistic. They are definitely realistic for middle-income countries can pay and should do more. And there it's often a matter of policy, because they don't want to deal with, marginalized population, with men who have sex with men, drug use and so on. And, is it then up to the international community to pay for that? That requires policy change. But with the Lancet UNAIDS Commission that I chaired, we found, there was Rob Hecht's work, that in sub-Saharan Africa, for concentrated epidemics and for generalized and hyper-endemic countries, they would need to spend over 50% of total government health expenditure just on HIV if they would have to pay the whole bill. That's not going to happen, and that should not happen. So it's extremely important that international solidarity, to use that old-fashioned word, that funding for the Global Fund, for PEPFAR, continues. And that will be necessary for many, many years to come. So formidable obstacles, and just two final reflections. One that Tony made also. In many places, we have a problem of strategy. It's all about treatment, and and there is just no talk anymore and no action and money for the so much needed combination prevention. And as Tony really very clearly showed, it's a package deal. You need it all. If you drop one element from that combination, we're going to fail. So there's a strategy issue, and that means that we have to adapt our messages. And finally, at least in Europe, the message on the end of AIDS has been quite counterproductive. We see lots of countries in Europe where the perception is it's over. They forget all the small print. And like in the UK, the Department for International Development, which was really a leader in funding for international AIDS programs, HIV is no longer on their agenda. So I think we need to rethink probably also the messaging, what we can achieve, even if the science is there, even if we have that ambitious agenda that we should not deviate from. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Diane?
Thanks very much. So maybe just a little bit of background about myself. I am a physician, and I run the HIV/AIDS program at San Francisco General Hospital. I started in HIV the moment I read that first MMWR report, which you saw in the talk today, and I was absolutely fascinated by that. I was a medical student at the time. I ultimately called the CDC, begged to work there in the summer. So those of you thinking about how your interest starts, just look for your passion and don't sit back and sit on the sidelines, and really act on it. Perhaps as a physician and as someone who works internationally and someone who's been very involved in the San Francisco movement, I wanted to share comments on the San Francisco response and maybe some challenges, and I think some myths exist that what we can't do in the global epidemic, and really present to you why I think that those are not true. So in San Francisco, from the very beginning, we had the components which I think are essential for a triad to an epidemic response. No one's ever ready when an epidemic comes out, but you absolutely need a partnership between science, policy and government, and community. And that's what happened at San Francisco in the very, very dark days when this epidemic came upon our city. So fast forward to where are we in terms of the beginning of the end of the HIV epidemic in San Francisco. Well, we never could be talking about this if it weren't for these pioneers at the beginning, which included Paul Voberding, Molly Cook, Eric Gooseby, who continue to be very active in the response. So I would say our response in this beginning, the end of AIDS, probably starts somewhere around 2009 or 10, when we, based on the evidence at hand where there was equipoise, we at our clinic at San Francisco General, we see about 3,000 patients, put forth a policy and recommendation to our patients to offer therapy to everyone. And at the time, this was quite controversial. It wasn't a top-down policy. We brought everyone together in an auditorium in San Francisco. We talked about it. We heard the various viewpoints. And that is a point when we think about we will never succeed in this, as if this is not a joint decision, discussion, transformation between science, policy, and community. So at that time, we put forth that policy, and I'm sure Dr. Fauci doesn't remember this, but I sent an email to him and I said, I just wanted to let you know this is what we're doing in San Francisco. And he sent me back this email, that's a bold move, Diane. And it was just very, very flattering, and I actually printed it out and I have it on my wall. And so, we want bold thinkers in this room. And so that's just a little bit of history behind that. Then after the International AIDS Conference in Washington, D.C., we came together as a community and we said, San Francisco, where are we? And literally, we had all these great science, all these innovative programs, and the community was there. We had it at the LGBT Center on Market Street, and someone raised their hand in the front row and said, this is great, all you speakers, just like this. Are you really working together? And we realized at that moment we were not working together as well as we could as a community. So we started the Getting to Zero movement in San Francisco, which is based on the principles of collective impact. And if those of you who work in global health, the students, if you haven't read about collective impact, please go read about it, because it's how you tackle big problems. You have multi-sector responses with a common goal, and that is, you heard from Dr. Fauci's presentation, exactly what we do in the HIV response. So practically, what we're doing in San Francisco is we're targeting 3 spearhead initiatives. The first is prevention. Prevention is at one of the core of what we're doing. As you saw, Kaiser, we were out front with PrEP, and now we're rapidly expanding PrEP. So that's the first thing we're doing. Secondly, we have a program called RAPID, which is essentially treatment upon diagnosis. And the concept, of course, is simple. We should start treatment. When someone goes to the hospital and has a heart attack, we don't say, well, you need to think about if you want to start therapy. It's going to be lifelong. We're not really sure. Are you sure you can do it? You're homeless. No. What we say is, here you are. You have a new diagnosis. This is what therapy does. We'd like to offer it. And the testing sites aren't always where one can access to the drugs, so we overcome the transportation barrier. We Uber the patients over, they jump in a taxi, they come to the clinic, we welcome them, we figure out all the logistics of care, we talk to them, and we help them also disclose. And just to give you a little anecdote about how this is empowering for the patients, the other day we had a patient who came in, a very young man, who shared with us the disclosure moment that he had, which was he had just been diagnosed. He called his mom up and he said, Mom, I need to tell you that I've got HIV, but don't worry, I started treatment today. And whereas people have been very fearful about pushing people too fast to therapy, I think it just tells us it can be very, very empowering. And then the third part of our triad in the San Francisco Getting to Zero effort is what Dr. Piat said, which is we're focusing on retention. Our healthcare system is trying to provide more access to everybody, but to be honest, staying in care in this day and age, healthcare, really everyone in this room who accesses it, is quite fragmented, and it's very, very complicated. And what happens is patients lose insurance X, their life is falling apart, relationships are falling apart, they lose their job, and then taking their medicines is the last thing they do. But if you stop taking your medicines in HIV, your viral load immediately rebounds. You can get sick, you spread it. So we have to figure out the systems for these patients. And what we always say in San Francisco is we don't need health systems, we need systems for health that meet the patients where they are. So this is how we've been approaching Getting to Zero in San Francisco. And if there's one thing I'd say, that the unbelievable progress that we've made, is really remarkable. But if we don't think of this as it's not business as usual, this is the moment. This is what Dr. Fauci told us to talk. This is the moment we need to invest. There has never been as many people as there are right now on the planet, 37 million living with HIV. It's mind-baffling why more people aren't concerned about this, but we certainly are, and we need to convince everyone to invest and not do business as usual. So, I'd just like to make a few comments about some of the work that we're doing in East Africa, where we have an ongoing project that's supported by PEPFAR and by NIH, where we're working in Uganda and Kenya with a community-wide test and treat approach. And that trial started a couple of years ago, and when we designed the trial, we thought specifically about all the obstacles that existed and tried to design systems within an implementation science framework to overcome those systems. So first of all, testing. Half the people in sub-Saharan Africa don't even know their HIV status. So we know that having people go to a clinic or a sign where it says get HIV testing works somewhat, but if we're going to get to 100% of people knowing their status, that's not going to work. So we brought the testing to the people. And what we did in rural areas is we did community health campaigns where we asked the community, if we did HIV testing, is there anything else you'd like to have? They were very opinionated about that. They said, we want diabetes, we want hypertension. We're like, we can do that. So what we've done is we've gone out in the communities in this project, done campaigns where over the course of 2 weeks, we can have about 8,000 people come through the whole campaign. And not only can they find out about their HIV status, they can also find about whether they have diabetes and hypertension. And we all need to think about how we leverage this infrastructure we've got in HIV for other non-communicable diseases. So with that, reaching out to people, we've been able to offer on a population level 90% testing. So that breaks myth number one, that cannot be done in very rural areas with no water, no electricity. Myth number two is that people who are not sick don't want to take therapy in Africa. This was so upsetting to us. Obviously, if we're going to do this test and treat, you would not believe how much pushback there was about this. Now it's true. People who are asymptomatic, it can be harder to have them retain on therapy. But we did some pilot studies, and we asked people, why would you want to take therapy? And they said, because I want to stay healthy. It was not something profound. So people do want to stay healthy, and they know the consequences of what happens when they don't take therapy. I think myth number three is that men don't participate in healthcare. And I think we need, 2/3 of the epidemic in Africa is women, but a third are men. And men we know rates of testing are lower, and that gap between getting testing and getting in care, and in Dr. Fauci's presentation, remember you were looking at what's the drivers? It's that linkage to care, okay? So what we have to figure out, what are the incentives to get men into care? And when we think about that, we have to think about gender-responsive approaches to health systems. So in this ongoing work to do, we've provided incentives that are gender-specific. Just to give you an example of some of the ones that we have for the men, that we have soccer games, we have hours that go outside on the weekends, they can get tested at night if that goes better with their work schedule. But what we've learned, we've been very successful to get men engaged in care, and in this study, that we're up to 90-90-90 in the study of 320,000 patients. You know what men tell us? There's two things that they want. They want to get into care fast and get in and out of care. And secondly, they want to be treated with respect. I think those are just fundamental things with care. And I think those are the kind of things we need to think about if we're going to change the way we deliver care and we're going to achieve these goals. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Tony, do you want to make any short comment, or
Yeah,
you
just-
spoke? Yeah.
Well, just a very, very brief comment, because it relates to several of the things that I said early and that Peter and Diane had said, is that, living in Washington the way I do, and have to deal with, the pulse of what the government and the Congress and administrations and others think about things that are high priority. I really am very concerned that if we are going to truly get to the point of achieving the goal that all of us here on stage want to achieve, we really have to keep HIV/AIDS on the radar screen of our leaders. It's striking how little attention is paid to HIV, and you could easily monitoring it by just go to a congressional hearing. And years ago, when I was testifying, all of my other co-institute directors used to get very upset because 95% of the questions were on HIV, and all the other people used to get upset. You know, I don't remember over the last couple of years the last question that anybody even asked me about HIV, even questions that I planted myself. They didn't ask. And then at the last year's hearing, some of you may be aware that there was this issue of the, and Peter touched upon that about the attitude sometimes in Europe and the UK, is that the question was asked is that since we've been so successful with HIV, do we really need to continue to support it? Which is absolutely stunning, because if you, as Diane was saying, if you look at the number of people that are infected, you know, my life was completely overcome a year and a half ago with Ebola. I mean, all I did all day long was Ebola, and everybody's getting exercised about Ebola. And then when I pointed out at one of the congressional hearings on Ebola, and not to diminish Ebola, but more people died of HIV/AIDS in 3 days than in the entire Ebola outbreak. And when you tell somebody that, they get jolted and say, really? Is that true? I mean, if you look at the 1.2 million deaths globally and the fact that there were 11,000 people died, it's not to diminish those tragic deaths in Ebola, but don't forget the perspective of HIV/AIDS. And what's happened, because it's 35 years old and we've been through an awful lot, there's sort of a numbness of how people respond to it. Well, you know, it's been around for a while. You have a lot of good scientific advances, so you're okay. We're not okay. You know, we're really not okay with 2 million new infections and 1.2 million deaths. And we got to keep the pressure on in every way that we possibly can. Otherwise, we're really not going to achieve this goal that I was talking about. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks, Tony. I think the tension that we have in what has been a breathtaking response to a disease, HIV, with struggles and successes all along the continuum, validating and reinforcing, allowing us to start to talk about a continuum of services that effectively stop progression in individuals, arrest progression through communities, if done really in an excellent way. It requires that kind of sustained rigor. We are now understanding that our own population in HIV and the populations in the same countries that carry the largest burden of HIV and continue to carry that are also now pivoting into a crescendo of NCDs, hypertension, diabetes, and coronary artery disease, as they are in the developed setting, that are going to dominate and increase morbidity and mortality for these populations. So I see this second wave of suffering right on the horizon, and that the only platforms, as Diane just said, that are up and running and capable of absorbing those additional services rest in the infrastructure that has been put in place from HIV. I couldn't underline more what Peter has emphasized and Tony and Diane have said about the need to sustain the focus, the need to give that understanding to policymakers and the donor community that this is not a time to pivot away, but to pivot into an expansion of services that are based on a continued support of the platform that has been put in place. That platform is not adequate now, but it is enough to allow hope to be part of what people in countries heavily burdened with vertical transmitted disease funded vertically now need to be open to the horizontal movement of resources to allow for expansion to accommodate the additional challenge that the NCDs are going to afford. I'm curious if our panel can react to some of those challenges in the context that you're aware of. What are the policy and political discussions that need to occur? What role do multilaterals should play, can play, in making this pivot sustained and effective? And what role does, I would say, implementation research, a better understanding of how to do it, to eliminate that barrier of putting a sustained program on ground? How can we better infiltrate that agenda into how we do our work in both the research and programmatic area? While you're thinking a little bit about all that scrambled eggs, people can start thinking about questions that they want to ask and can start to queue up to the microphones, and we'll open up to the audience. Any thoughts on that?
Good, we got our own mics here. No, as everybody said, and coming back to Eric's points and then what Tony's intervention, my feeling is that we need to capitalize on the science and all the enormous achievements against all odds, but then try to think how to translate that into new policy, maybe new coalition, new positioning, in order to sustain the efforts. Because what people may not realize always is that even at the current intensive level of effort, if we just continue that, so the business as usual scenario, that will result in an increased number of new infection and increase in deaths. We did some fairly conservative type of modeling for our report that came out in the Lancet, and so that even with that kind of intensive effort is not good enough. And it's like has been the case in the epidemic all the time, is the better we do now, the cheaper and the more effective it will be later on. That's one point. Secondly, much of our achievements were driven and pushed for by activism, civil society activism. And there is I'm looking for where is that activism today. When you take South Africa, for example, the Treatment Action Campaign has been really at the forefront of making things happen in South Africa, often against all odds. So at the time, particularly when President Mbeki was in charge, and was in a denial mode. That activism is, and that civil society action is basically, I'm not saying gone, but is at a very low level. And so the push, the watchdog function and all that is no longer there. And that's another question that we should ask. Why is that so? And can we do something? You cannot create just an activist community and so on. Certainly not from here. But that is an issue. And then, so we need to be smarter also. Where are the allies? With what to? And Eric, your point about the chronic diseases that are going to loom without HIV, but also among the people living with HIV, that may be one opportunity. You're the high-level representative on TB. I mean, these communities have been separate for too long. So I think we need some renewed thinking, and perhaps the conference in Durban is an opportunity for doing that, being in a highly symbolic place, because when it happened there in 2000, that was a turning point in the agenda.
So maybe just to comment a little bit about NCDs and the changing epidemiology. One of the things that when one thinks about just delivering HIV care, one of the observations we made, which is not surprising, first of all, HIV is a chronic disease. When we have brought together multiple chronic diseases in testing and in care delivery, it reduces stigma. Okay? So this is something where not only is it beneficial to leverage HIV services and build capacity for NCD, it's also beneficial for HIV care, just in terms of stigma, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is on us. One of the major challenges, whether you live in San Francisco or whether you live in East Africa and going forward. I think things that we need to do, 2 action items I would say definitely, is we need to engage most of these countries now, and you're more the experts than I am. I know where we work, there's a minister of non-communicable diseases. To be engaging the minister of non-communicable communicable diseases and all the work we're doing in the research and in the programmatic development. And then Dr. Fauci outlined the areas of discovery. We have a charge ahead of us, which is we have to massively increase access and put the evidence into action with PrEP and with ART, but we need to study it while we do it. And that has been called implementation science, and we absolutely need to support that if we are going to succeed in the task. So those would be some of my suggestions.
Can I just something I forgot to illustrate the gap between our science and what's happening and the political problems we're facing. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service recently decided not to fund pre-exposure prophylaxis PrEP. And that in the middle of a real epidemic among gay men in London and in the big cities. And you know, and there was no public outcry. I mean, there are a few protests and that's it. And so that for me is should be a wake-up call, and I don't say that this is the same here, but in Europe, I think we are now in a state of new denial about the problems, and we're going to pay this very, very dearly later.
Thank you. Okay, first question.
Hi, I was just wondering if there have been any economic studies that show when you reduce funding or programs, how much is lost in terms of the gains that had already been made, and then how much more funding it would take just to get back to the place where we were, versus if you hadn't cut that funding and you hadn't cut programs, how much less, it seems to me you probably spend less if you don't cut funding and you just keep things going. And I just wondered if there are any studies like that, because I know nothing about economics. It's just, do we know this, and would that be something that might convince politicians when you're talking with them?
You know, we'll take about three questions, and then we'll react to that. Here.
Hi, my name's Katrina. I am a fourth-year med student at Boston University, and I'm part of AMSA, the American Medical Students Association AIDS Advocacy Network. And we just had a Hill lobby day in DC. There were very few people that came along, and I think that there's a hesitance or a reluctance of people who are in public health and especially in medicine to do lobbying or to just educate their members of Congress on these issues. And I wonder if you have any advice for those of you that have done advocacy, I think that's all of you, how we can help flip the switch in people to say that we have the experience of treating patients and working on programs, we have the knowledge, and we just need to make time in our own global health agendas to build our relationships with our legislators, educate them about what's going on in this opportunity to, not end AIDS to, I like your point about how maybe that we need to reframe the message, but we need to get to zero. We need to double the number of people on treatment in the next several years. So I just wonder if you can give us some advice about how we can see ourselves as possibly organizers or agents of change, and how to accept our political responsibilities in addition to our clinical.
Great question. Is that a microphone in the back? I guess not. One more here, and then we'll let the group react.
Good morning. My name is Vasant. I'm a third-year medical student from the Medical University of South Carolina. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about maternal to fetal transmission of HIV worldwide, and what we're doing to sort of stymie those sort of transmissions, and where we are in that effort. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll start reacting and then let folks chime in. This group of people up here has made the counterfactual argument more times than we can count to anybody with a pot of money. It has been a strategy that really goes back to the early outbreak of HIV and the organization that had to go forward in the passage of the Ryan White Care Act. I see folks in the audience who were very instrumental in that act, which warms my heart. But who are still in the fight and focused on it. but that kind of strategy to argue for a sustained funding is helpful, but it has rarely won the day, but should be part of your package of argument. To that same note, I think that providers of care, educators in health, who are sophisticated in their understanding of the impact that a disease, HIV in this instance, TB, any disease, has on patients, on a patient, that knowledge translated to a policymaker is powerful. It's powerful in also you are demonstrating by your advocacy the urgency and the clarity of your understanding as to why you have elevated this as a priority, enough so that you're there talking to them about this issue. The power of the provider educator is profound and one that is always part of the narrative. I think that when you are in advisory relationships, Tony, Peter, Diane have been in these at different levels within the system. You are talking to the person who's going to make the allocation decision. Your job, as you saw demonstrated by Tony in his presentation, is to translate the science so that policymaker, as best as they can, with your help and support, understands what the implications are from a scientific perspective and makes the priority decision and the allocation decision informed by that. I believe you are in the best position to convey that to those types of decisions. So, any other thoughts that people want to put in there?
Very briefly on the economic side, that this kind of studies have been done, this modeling, and there is no ambiguity. I mean, if one decreases funding and efforts, I mean, it's going up. I mean, the number of cases will go up, people will die, and so on. So, but perhaps we haven't really translated that enough in something simple, straightforward, and in terms of the political advocacy, I've been thinking about new alliances, who are the champions, and going out of our own comfort zone and see where, do we need new types of arguments and so on. I mean, for us it's crystal clear, but that's obviously not the case for everybody.
Just to amplify about the question about being an advocate when you go down to see congressmen or legislators, is that you have to give them, first of all, going down once and then saying, I made my visit and going home is useless. This is what I do every day, but my batting average is not 1,000. For every 5 times that I've gone down, I've gotten a response once because they get bombarded with a lot of requests. What they really do relate to, importantly, is numbers that they could figure out about cost savings. And one of the arguments, I was thinking of what you were saying about not wanting to fund PrEP in the UK. So I had a similar discussion about prevention at a congressional hearing this past year in which I gave a figure that absolutely floored them because they never realized that for every infection that you prevent in the United States, you save a lifetime of $328,000. So they were arguing about why we really need to be pushing on this prevention. So if you get those numbers for them to digest them, they realize that maybe they really should be continuing the support because sooner or later, the people who allocate resources are going to have to pay. So the question is, do you want to pay now and pay less, or do you want to forget about it and pay more later? And we've got to keep drilling home that lesson to them because they don't quite get it. They respond when they see an overwhelming burden, but they don't look ahead. So that's what I would suggest for the young woman who said that, what hints when you go down and talk to your legislators when you want to be advocates.
Maybe I just want to encourage you that maybe the turnout wasn't as much as you want, but if all of us here told you all the failures and all the times we have done something and didn't work and we gave up. Please don't give up. That's the one thing. You have to have a hard skin, be tough skin, and be determined. I want to make one comment on the mother-to-child transmission, and that is that every case of that's a public health failure. Like, we know how to prevent this. So we are making progress. There's still hundreds of thousands of transmissions. It's not just during pregnancy. We had some policy that was complicated. It was difficult to implement it. Fortunately now, everyone understands we need to treat all women, all men, pregnant, not pregnant. The challenge is when women get pregnant, often they can go on therapy, but then after therapy, women breastfeed, that keeps their baby healthier. That's when the challenge comes up, and about a third of the transmission comes during breastfeeding. So once again, this gets back to systems. This gets back to implementation. We don't blame the client. We say, what is it with our systems that's making it difficult for women to follow along with therapy so that they can have children who are not infected with HIV?
Thanks, Diane. 1, 2, 3. Question.
Hi, my name is Akil Yachuri. Thank you guys for this really interesting panel. I had a question about sort of the narrative of the HIV epidemic in modern times, more of the increasing fatigue with the problem and apathy that's arising. And as the Bay Area is kind of one of the epicenters of progress against this epidemic, I was wondering if this increasing apathy in the developed world is affecting the narrative in developing areas and how it's sort of changing the international approach to this problem. I hope that made sense. Did it? Okay, thank you.
Good morning. Jason O'Grady, Mayo Clinic. As a family physician, I was really disappointed to see that statistic that 1/3 of my primary care colleagues didn't even hear about PrEP. And I was hoping to hear some ideas or strategies to mobilize and educate our primary care workforce in this area.
Good question. Please.
Hi, I'm Noelle Sullivan. I'm at Global Health Studies and Anthropology at Northwestern University. And I really appreciate not only the tireless decades of work that you've all done on this issue, but also the talk today about implementation science and systems. And I wanted to hear a little bit more from you because you're in an audience of people, some of whom are dealing with financing and implementing these particular policies, about what you wish they would pay more attention to. Because, for instance, with the way the budgeting works in East Africa and Tanzania, where I work, you have to spend the money that you budget as soon as it arrives, but it always arrives late. So people are scrambling on the bottom to spend all the money. So right now, the HIV clinics all have playgrounds attached to them. In the same country where you don't have playgrounds attached to any schools or anything else because they had to spend the money that they needed to spend, otherwise it goes away. And I see this kind of thing often where the furniture is much nicer in the HIV clinic than it is anywhere else in the same hospitals where they're missing pediatric antibiotics. And so I think it's not just more money, but also how do we figure out more flexible models for allocating those funds, for dealing with the fact that sometimes we can't actually get the funds allocated in a timely manner, and what are some of the ways that you can perceive of that policymakers and implementers might actually think about those complex issues? Thank you.
Great. I think it is time for the global health community to reflect on what its aim and targets need to be. We have not gotten clear about what we need and how we need to align our resources so they are able to effectively identify the investment that is going to create the outcome and impact that is desired and needed. Donor monies, conduits of access, of entry into country need to be revisited. Donors need to reconsider how their resources move both vertically, but more importantly, the willingness to allow those resources to move out of the silo to support needs that by any criteria would be prioritized over what your vertical budget is now demanding that you release those funds for. That kind of creativity requires a convener and someone who is given the license to make those prioritizations and make the allocation decision. It's time that the global health community swing into a debate around direct resources to country, to trust our colleagues in country, usually convened or in the form of the Ministry of Health and civil society, to decide on what the available resources coming from donor, added to country resources, and the third pot that we have rarely unpacked are the out-of-pocket costs that patients and families present at the door to get those services, get the blood drawn, or get the pharmaceutical. I think that you really make me flip into that challenge. So, anybody else want to react to some of the other questions?
So the issue about getting the message out is really, really tough because messaging doesn't always work. And as we all know, it's painfully. With regard to primary care physicians, I would think that one of the most effective ways would be through the medical societies that people belong to make sure that the leaders of those societies put those kinds of information issues right up front. You were disturbed by that statistic. I was really disturbed when I saw it, particularly when you have such an effective regimen that's available. It's really disgraceful that when something really, really works and someone doesn't know it works. And the way we need to do it is to just be very, very aggressive in public service type announcements, which we try to do. CDC tries to do that and does it, I think, a reasonably good job. But we still need to crack that 1/3. That's unacceptable that they don't know about it.
We also on the question about, let's say, the contamination of the narrative, it's unavoidable because when leaders in wherever country don't see anymore that there are high-level meetings or summits or whatever, even if often, when you sit in there, I think is another, words, but they had really an impact. So when the narrative is going down, particularly in the US, which has been and continues to be such a leader in this field, that has a worldwide impact, and we shouldn't be naive about that. That is a global reality. Yeah.
Maybe just one quick comment about the knowledge of PrEP. It's a two-way street. We absolutely need to encourage consumer demand, so it comes from there. And then secondly, I can't imagine anyone in this room was not disturbed by that statistic. I didn't know that, and it's just shocking. Almost just what you need to do is put that statistic out there to the group and have the family practitioners say, how are we going to solve this? Because people need to own it. It's not going to come from top down.
Great. Sam.
Sam Matheny, University of Kentucky. Just a comment, because global is also local. The issue about costs is really one that I think hasn't really been probably identified as as a significant barrier, particularly with PrEP. I'm in a state where we had a very successful Medicaid expansion program, and our newly elected governor in November, his first order of business was to try to remove 300,000 people from the Medicaid rolls. And within a difficulty with some of the health insurance policies covering PrEP, and we had an AIDS drug reimbursement program we started a number of years ago, but those funds have not been expanding to really keep up with what the need would be for PrEP expansion and issues. So I'm just saying, what is your knowledge about what we in this country, being an example of what the rest of the world should be doing, are preparing to be able to fund the PrEP programs that we really need to do?
Boy, let me think about that one. That's a tough question. We'll do that one, and then we'll answer.
Bob Townley at Creighton University in Omaha. I have a question regarding the immunologic aspects, particularly in terms of checkpoint inhibitors, which obviously are having a field day in terms of metastatic malignancy. But I know there's people that have been treated, or people who are HIV infected but have been treated and have a normal T-cell count, no viral detection in the blood. but still have elevated levels of checkpoint inhibitors, PD-1, PD-L1. And I wonder if there's any further studies that would be appropriate in the role of checkpoint inhibitors in HIV.
Yeah, hi, Quentin Eichbaum, Vanderbilt University. It's a bit of a controversial topic, but I'm kind of curious, in light of PEPFAR's allocation of funding to Africa, what the best allocation is. And Dr. Gooseby, you were very involved, obviously, with MEPI, and we all are wondering whether MEPI funding is going on. My question more directly is, there seems to be a diversion of funding or allocation of funding towards capacitating scientific research in those settings, and that's clearly a good initiative, but I'm curious about whether that time should be now, given all the other kind of priorities. And to me, capacitating physicians and education in those countries might be a higher priority than capacitating scientific research within laboratories. And I'm not saying they're exclusive. I'm just curious about the timing of that initiative and what your thoughts are about that.
Okay. I'll start with the ADAPT question. I think that the Obama administration, the Affordable Care Act, swung into the dialogue around the Ryan White Care Act, Sam, that you took such loving care of in its inception, and had a fight around who would do what, where it would start and stop, and ADAP was very much in that back and forth. I think that discussion is still open in that they have not fully decided what to do with Ryan White in light of the Affordable Care Act, and with your long history of connections to principals in that dialogue, would think it might not be a bad idea to engage again around the specifics to actually get a real fix to it. The dilemma about states that do not want to take full advantage of the resources available is a dilemma. We live in a country that where states have a sovereignty around what they do or don't invest in healthcare and in services that are available from the federal government. And I know for Ryan White in general, the whole corridor from the southeast part of the United States has been a frustration, both in the child care services, maternal and child health, as well as in Ryan White services, to deliver available resources already on the table, not being taken advantage of. I don't have a fix for you, though. It's definitely something that has been long and frustrating. Yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer. Tony, do you have any idea about the cancer checkpoint?
Yeah, the problem that we're seeing when we have people who are on antiretroviral therapy, they don't have any detectable plasma viremia because it's below the level of detection, and they have CD4 counts that are normal, 5, 7, 800. They're still not normal because they have a level of aberrant immune activation that involves the expression of activation markers that I believe is the reason why we're seeing so many of the comorbidities, particularly in the arena of cardiovascular disease. Regarding the immunological implications of checkpoint inhibitors, I think they're just a manifestation of an underlying amount of still not suppressed immune activation, that we're having a lot of trouble suppressing it, but it's there. We see it in people who are treated for years and have almost no blips. They just have essentially undetectable viremia. If you look at their profiles of immune activation, they're still activated, and I think that's what's explaining what you're referring to.
Sure. Andrew Fisher, graduate student, University of Miami, and Global Health Fellow at Duke University. And when we think of diseases on a global level, I can't help but think about all of the different cultures, religions, and communities it affects. I'm just wondering if you could comment on the importance of cultural sensitivity and how we can make sure that these prevention and treatments are accepted into the different cultures around the world.
Okay. Two more questions, and then we'll let people go, and we'll stay and answer these, though.
Sheila Davis, University of Denver. What research questions need to be addressed around PrEP?
Trish Davidson, Dean of the School of Nursing at Johns Hopkins. Firstly, thanks to the panel and congratulations, Dr. Fauci, on the award. Dr. Havley mentioned stigma, and I just wanted to make a comment and a question is how much of this maybe apathy around funding and attention is as a consequence that HIV is no longer a white middle class problem and impacting on those that are most marginalized in society.
My name is Jonathan Nellermo at the Center for Global Surgery at the University of Utah. I have a question about closed funding systems. So in a closed system of limited resources, it makes sense that as we have a problem finally under control, we might shift resources to a new emerging problem. And I agree with the panel that it's not the time to pivot away from successful efforts. We need to reinforce and lay hold of the durable solution that our speaker referenced earlier. But in view of NCDs that are on the rise, maybe we need to open the financial systems that we look to for funding rather than place these in competition. So I'm asking the panel if you can comment on how we can create new money for these problems.
Well, yeah, it's a frustration for everyone who works in this arena. I do believe that we do need to do a value for money exercise with our existing funds. I think donor, country, and out-of-pocket resources need to be looked at differently by country leadership and allow for the synergies that are possible when those pots are revealed to occur without understanding how much is in each pot and that you have the license to move money between pots, you will not be able to make much of a difference. But with that opening up, you can actually be very creative in saving money and then redirecting those saved resources back into program. PEPFAR for the last 7 years has had downward funding, about a minus 15% from 2009 forward. And it was that type of strategy that allowed for 6 to 7 time expansions in treatment, testing. PMT-CT program was basically invigorated from a very low level of activity initially. Pediatric treatment, male circumcision was non-existent before 2009 and came in and is now at $9 million, all from monies that were brought back into the program by those savings. The donor and out-of-pocket pots need to be re-engaged, and those are pretty much all that's on the table. Otherwise, you've got to ask for new appropriations.
Yeah, the question makes people flinch when you say new money. There is new money. The question is to get our country as a nation and the world, this is the Consortia of Universities for Global Health, the world to realize what the relative importance and priority you put in on health. We have a limited amount of money that we put on PEPFAR, Global Fund, NIH Research, CDC, because a decision is made that in the order of priorities, it's not that it's a low priority, but it's not a high enough priority to meet the demands of what we need. And and I struggle with this in the discussions and the arguments, if you want to call them that I have in Washington, is that we really do need a reordering of the priorities. Now, they could tell me, well, okay, you're in health, Dr. Fauci, and I could bring in someone in another arena that can give me the same argument for them. But I think there's something very special about health and the human condition that I think is of high enough priority that we really do need to re-examine why we're falling short of funding in PEPFAR and why I go to a congressional hearing a couple of months ago and senator and a congressman says, I think we spent enough money on HIV, we need to go spend it on something else. I mean, that is really unfortunate, is the calm word that I would use for that. But I think the thing we need to emphasize is that we ultimately will have to pay for these issues with health. And again, getting back to what I said before, the upfront commitment to that will ultimately be less than what we're trying to do when we catch up. So I don't think it's a question of new money that the questioner asked, but it's really a question of resetting your priorities. It's easy for us to say we're all in health, but I think the priority of health belongs where it is. It's very high.
I'm being very courteously told that we've gone way over time, so we will close the yeah, thanks. I just wanted to thank the panel for really a fascinating discussion. I think the challenges are in front of us, but I'm proud to have walked the path that we've walked together for all four of us up here, and we'll continue to do so. So thanks, you guys.